Hello, my name's Harvey Leake, and I'm going to share a presentation that I made this year at the Zane Grey West Society Convention. It has to do with one of Zane Grey's amazing novels called The Vanishing American. And in this novel, one of the interesting things is that he modeled many of his fictional characters after real life people. I'll be focusing on a certain man, a Navajo man named Taddytin, that he used as a model for one of his characters, and the very fascinating but tragic story that goes along with that. Zane Grey called himself a writer of romantic history. And what this means to me is, first of all, he called his novels romances because they involved love affairs between people and between people in the landscape. And that was clearly some made up narrative. But the fact that he threw the word history in there makes you realize that he was trying to capture some real life events that did happen in the areas that he was writing about. He actually said, "I claim fidelity to the history of our West." So that would make it sound that like he was trying to actually be accurate in what he wrote about history, even though this was in novels. So a couple of questions I'd like to cover in this talk is, in the Vanishing American book, how accurate is Gray's historical narrative, and whether the novel contains some factual history that is not documented elsewhere. In other words, is it kind of a history book that we can learn from, that we wouldn't know certain things that are in the other historical documents? As far as the romantic part of the book, um, it's very clear. It starts out with a man named Nofai, who is said to be a Nopa Indian, and that's clearly Navajo, his code word for Navajo, and a woman from the East named Marion Warner, and a love affair between those two people. These were clearly fictional people, although he was probably influenced by real life people in putting them together, but he took a lot of liberties in the narrative that involves those two people. But we want to talk about another character he called Doatin. There again, a Nopa Indian, in other words, code word for Navajo, and the real life person that inspired this character. What a grand old Indian. He thrilled me, so calm, so somber and aloof before these men. So clearly, Zane Grey was creating a character that he greatly respected. In another passage, he talked about uh, uh, his daughter Gekken Yashi, but he also described Doatin as a man little beyond middle age, stalwart, deep chested, with massive head and great rolling eyes like those of an ox. So he was even given a physical description of his character, which I believe we'll see matches the real man, Taddytin, that he was modeling him after. And then, in a kind of an exceptional clue as to who the real man was, at the start of The Vanishing American, uh, he talks about the hero's two shepherd dogs, and he named them Taddy and Tinny. Well, he was alluding to the name of the real man behind Doatin, who was a man named Taddytin. And this is a photo of the actual Navajo man that he was writing about. Note that there are several different ways to spell his name. And the story isn't complete without talking about his daughter in the novel, Gekinyashi, the Little Beauty. She's 14 years old and large for her age. I know her father, Doatin the gentleman. He is a fine old Indian. There again, uh, showing great respect for the fictional character, and I think that reflects Zane Grey's respect for the real man, Taddytin. And we're very fortunate to have photos of some of these people. Jeanette Taddytin was Taddytin's daughter, and clearly the model for Gekanyashi. The story takes place in northeastern Arizona. Just to get oriented, if we go to the northeastern area and draw a rectangle around some country in the Navajo and Hopi region, down in the southwest corner is a town of Tuba City in real life. And in the northeast corner is a town of Kayente. Some people call it Kayenta, but I'll call it Kayente because that's the traditional pronunciation. If we get a vintage map from Zane Grey's time period of this area, this is what it looks like. And in the novel, Zane Grey has a place that he called Mesa, which is clearly modeled after Tuba or Tuba City. He described it in the book as having stone structures, a wide tree-lined avenue with well-built gray stone houses on one side and large red stone government buildings on the other. The buildings were a boarding school that the federal government had built to educate Native American kids that lived around there. So they had to come and live at the school. And this reflects a real true story of the settlement of Tuba City. You can see the tree-lined avenue and the boarding school kids standing there, Native American kids who were compelled to go there and go to school. Then the other significant location, which Zane Grey called Kaidab, was an outpost way up in a remote area, and it was a settlement of Kayente. There again, his description matches the true-to-life place. It was a trading post showing striking aspects of life and activity, and he wrote about huge bags of burlap containing wool that were being packed there. On the right, the photos at Kayente, the top photo is the actual trading post, and you can see the piles of wool that the Navajos would bring in and trade for food and other provisions, and that's why it was called a trading post. This photo was actually taken by Zane Grey in 1913 on his first trip to that area. And below that are the residents of Kayente, the Wetherells. John and Louisa Wetherell were my great-grandparents, and their two kids, Ben and Georgia Ida, who was called Sister. Sister was my grandmother. So that's a connection to this story that's pretty special to me. Another important character Zane Grey called Blucher. And in the book it said, Mr. Blucher, who is he? The agent in charge of the reservation. Well, he was modeled after a real man too, named Walter Runtke. He wasn't in charge of the entire Navajo reservation. He was in charge of what was called the Western Navajo Agency. And that is where a boarding school was, the boarding school at Tuba City. So he was the superintendent of the boarding school and the agent in charge of the Western Navajo Agency. Well, to get to the tragic part of the story, in the novel, Blucher ordered the arrest of Doa-10. And someone advised him to send three men, Rohr, Glendon, and Naylor, at night to arrest Doa-10, and advised he would refuse to consent to the new rule of the government. He will resist arrest. And so Blucher said he would go along with this arrest. In real life, Walter Runtke did order the arrest of Taddytin. He wrote this letter to a man named Mr. Robertson, and asked him to enlist two other men, Ashley Wilson and a man named Mr. Nash. He said, I would much like to see Taddytin brought in chains if necessary. Well, what happened was the three men went out a very remote area where Taddytin was, and they ended up shooting Taddytin. Uh, in the novel, it said Doatin refused to obey, as I heard the story. When Rohr and his deputies, Glendon and Naylor, tried to arrest Doatin, he fought, and they had to kill him. We have this photo of the actual man, Miss Ashley Wilson, who shot Taddytin, and he was the model for the man in the book. So this is a passage where Gekanyashi, Doatin's daughter, was informed that her father was dead. He was killed last night, killed because he fought the white men who went to arrest him. But it was sin that killed him. He would not obey. And this is a letter talking about the actual murder. This fellow had him by both wrists. The first man jumped on Taddytin, and Taddytin gave a quick jump and jerked away from the second man and dropped over with his head this way. The first man jumped away and ran to his overcoat and jerked out a pistol, and Taddytin was just in the act of straightening up when he fired a shot and he fell. So this is the actual historical document that describes the killing of Taddytin, which Zane Grey modeled as Doatin in the book. Well, to make a long story short, the three men and the Indian agent were tried, but they were acquitted by the courts. And so there was no justice done for the killing of Taddytin. And to kind of justify what happened, Walter Ruhnke came up with all kinds of allegations against Taddytin. He recognized no rules of law or order. He made it sound like Taddytin was a hardened criminal that did every crime in the book. He called him the arch Navajo criminal on the reservation, and probably the worst and most criminal character on the whole reservation. A man guilty of more heinous offenses than any Indian of his time, as is witnessed by every Indian as well as white who had any dealings with him. He claims that when he arrived on this job, Navajos began bringing in complaints against Taddytin for diverse offenses, such as committing rape, stealing horses and cattle, holding up other Navajos and forcing them to hand over what money they had on their persons, cruelly beating up his own father and brother and one of his wives. So Walter Ruhnke is painting Taddytin as a real desperado. Here's some other things. He didn't allow his daughter to go to the boarding school. He was planning to come and do injury to the agency. I felt that it was absolutely necessary that I see Taddytin personally, and if possible, place him under arrest. So that was Walter Ruhnke's story. But was Taddytin, the real man, really guilty? And we have some very strong evidence to show that these were lies that Walter Ruhnke made up to justify what he had done. We've seen some of the things that Zane Grey wrote about his fictional character, Doatin. Gentleman, what a grand old Indian. He thrilled me, so calm, so somber, aloof, stalwart. He occupied a position of respect and dignity in the tribe by reason of his intelligence. And he talked about wise old men like Taddytin. In real life, my great-grandmother, Louisa Wetherell, knew Taddytin, and she said we respect him. She told him, you are more intelligent than most men. So what Walter Runtke wrote about Taddytin and what a criminal he was is very suspect based on this. After the murder, an inspector came and talked to my great-grandmother and asked her what she thought of the whole thing. And she said she was very much in favor of the prosecution of all the employees who were in any way responsible for the death of Taddytin. So she knew the people involved. She knew Taddytin. She had known him, and she felt like they needed to be prosecuted for the murder. Another very strong indication of Taddytin's innocence. The superintendents of the boarding school at Tuber City were required to send in annual reports to their headquarters back in Washington, D.C. And one of the subjects that they covered was law and order. So this is 1911. The superintendent at that time wrote that there's been no crime of a serious nature committed here for the past several years. And he credited the assistance of police and judges. Well, police and judges were Navajo people that they hired for minimal wages to go out and just keep the peace. And strikingly, we found out that one of the policemen was none other than Taddytin. And we've got this fine photo of him, which, by the way, it was in the Wetherell's collection. So my great-grandparents wanted to preserve this record of their friend Taddytin. And then there's a government record showing his service dates. In 1912, Superintendent Jeffries reported that there were no crimes committed during this past year. In 1913, a new superintendent came in, and he said they were maintaining law and order. We have very little difficulty in this direction. Next year, he said, is not difficult to maintain order on this reservation, as for the most part, this tribe is very peacefully disposed. Then Walter Runtke came in I wrote the 1915 report, and he said, as a whole, these people are quite free from lawlessness, and there is very little crime committed among them. However, the next year, after he was involved with the killing of Taddytin, he talked about it in his report, and he said, without doubt, was guilty of probably all the crimes in the calendar. So to me, it's clear that there was no crime being committed, as Walter Runtke had described, and he was just making this up. It was actually perjury because he wanted to justify his own involvement in the killing. Another strong testimony was one from Taddytin's brother at Lohi. And so part of the investigation, they went and interviewed various Navajo people, and this is one of them. He said, what did they kill him for? He worked for the government, and the Americans knew him. Taddytin had never done anything that he should be killed for, as he had never bothered a white person or taken anything belonging to white men. He had never done anything really wrong that we knew about, and that we could not understand why he was killed, because he had never raped anybody or done anything dishonest that he should be killed for, that was not serious. And it bothered quite a number of the Indians who knew he had done nothing serious that he should be killed for. He had never stolen any horses, burros, or sheep, or cattle, and never done anything serious, and never treated white people mean and done anything to him. So this is a very strong testimony, too, that Walter Runtke was making up those allegations. I just want to talk in general about other aspects of Zane Grey's historical narrative that show how careful he was to be accurate. One of them involves another character in the book he called Reverend Friel, and he talked about an incident. Friel was the missionary to the Moki Indians, Nokai, who were actually the code word for the Hopis. And he talked about the Hopis cast a lasso, the noose over Friel's neck. Haul him out, yelled the leader. Then the mounted Noki rode away from the school, drawing the lasso taut and dragging the missionary out through the crowd. Well, Reverend Friel was really based on a real person named Reverend Jacob B. Fry. And we have this account of Reverend Fry's life, this true account, in which it has this story. One day, the Hopis tried to kill Mr. Fry. They put a rope around his neck and tied it in a knot. One Hopi was on horseback, and they intended to drag me and choke me. Then they had a man on the horse with a saddle on, and he fastened the rope on the saddle pommel and pulled from the saddle to drag him to death. So this is a real story that somehow Zane Grey knew about, and he incorporated in the book. So it's real history other than a few changes he made. Another case involves two characters in the novel, Beatrice and Robert Wolterson. It says Wolterson had come to the desert in search of health. He was a cattleman and received an appointment from the government to be inspector of Indian stock and the ranges adjacent to Mesa. And with him was his wife, Mrs. Wolterson. Well, these are based on real people also, Lillian Wilhelm and Westbrook Robertson. And Westbrook was hired by the Western Navajo Agency as a stockman. He was married to Lillian Wilhelm, who, by the way, was Zane Grey's wife's cousin, who came out with Zane Grey in 1913 and went to Rainbow Bridge with him. She also came out with him in 1914 and fell in love with the country and moved to Tuba City in 1917. Met the stockman Robertson, and they got married. So in the novel is a letter reproduced to Mr. Wolterson from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, and it starts out, reports indicate that your services as stockman are not satisfactory. And it goes on to explain why he was being reviewed in a negative way. That's actually a copy, almost verbatim, of a real letter from the real Commissioner of Indian Affairs to Westbrook Robertson that starts out identically. Reports indicate that your services as stockman are not satisfactory. So somehow Zane Grey got a hold of this letter, probably from either Westbrook or Lillian, and he used it in the novel. And he was very accurate, obviously, in his history. So in the novel, the two people were at odds with Blucher, the Woltersons, and they ended up getting transferred to a different boarding school at a place called King Point. Well, in reality, Westbrook and Lillian Robertson got transferred to a place called Crown Point. So you can see just a minor change of the name, and that was a boarding school. The top photo on the right is a reproduction of a painting Lillian Wilhelm Robertson made of Crown Point, New Mexico. Another person in the book that's very close to real life is Mrs. John Withers. Uh, Here she is talking. All my life I've been among the Indians, said Mrs. Withers in her low voice. I loved the Indians when I was a child. I've been here in this wild country for many years. It takes years of kindness and study to understand the Indian. This is an article Zane Grey wrote about his 1922 trip to K&T. So it's not fiction, it's nonfiction, and his real impressions of the place. And obviously, Mrs. John Withers was modeled after my great grandmother, Louisa Wade Wetherell. We rested several days at K&T, where I watched the Navajos with ever-growing pity. Mrs. Wetherell, whose Indian name was Austin Sosi, and that means slim woman, knew more of the Navajos than any other white person. She had lived all her life among them. It was to be my good fortune to give the world of readers much of her knowledge. And I think in this Vanishing American, he did so. He talks about the Withers home in the novel. Uh, a wonderful room that seemed to flash Indian color and design. Blankets on floor and couch, baskets on the mantel and wall, and a strange painted frieze of Indian figures, crude, elemental, striking. These lent the room its atmosphere. A bright fire blazed in the open stone fireplace. Books and comforts were not lacking. This room opened into a long dining room with the same ornamental Indian effects. And that describes exactly the Wetherell's home, the living room and dining room. So Zane Grey had a lot of factual historical information that he incorporated into this book. And it will be interesting to look into who told him about it, because maybe some of it was firsthand knowledge, but some of it obviously he learned from other insiders. In this version of the Vanishing American, the most recent version, which was revised, Zane Grey's son, Lauren, wrote a foreword, and he said, the background information for The Vanishing American was furnished to my father by the trader John Wetherell and his wife, Louisa. So that makes it clear that Zane Grey, in talking to John and Louisa Wetherell, learned a lot of the details of this history that he was able to incorporate into the book. Another interesting thing, Zane Grey came to K&T in 1922, but his wife, Dolly Grey, also made her own trip that year in May and stayed at the Wetherells and talked to my great-grandmother. Some of us have gone through the massive collection of Zane Grey papers at the Brigham Young University archives in the library. And we found this interesting entry. It's diary of Dolly Grey's trip to New York and returned in 1922. And it said it contains profound observations about Louisa Wetherell, the missionaries and Indians on Navajo Reservation. Unfortunately, the pages that cover this subject are missing from this typescript, but we're hoping to find that account sometime. But we do know that Louisa talked to Dolly Grey and gave her information on the subject that's in the Vanishing American book. We also know that Zane Grey spent some time in Tuba City in 1914. This is a little newsletter that the agency doctor's daughter put together. And for this particular date, she said Zane Grey and party arrived Sunday instead of Tuesday, and thus will have a longer stay. So I think he was able to get kind of a feeling for what was going on in Tuba City, the conditions at the boarding school, and even meet some of the people that he wrote about. And then we also know that he met Zane Grey's daughter, Jeanette. This is a photo that Zane Grey took, and he he labeled it Gekken Yashi of Vanishing American. And Jeanette is the girl on the right, a photo taken by Zane Grey. Another character in the book that undoubtedly told Zane Grey a lot about what was going on in Tuba City. Fictionally, he was called Young Ramsdell. He was another missionary, but one that Zane Grey liked. He called him a rough diamond, a hard-riding parson, and that he was not liked by the other missionaries or the agent Blucher. Well, he was obviously modeled after a real man named Hugh or Shine Smith. And Shine Smith and Zane Grey had quite a relationship later. After the book and movie came out in 1925, Zane Grey had Shine Smith chaperone these Native Americans, Navajos and Hopis, to New Zealand and Australia. And there's a picture of Shine Smith on the left on Zane Grey's boat. So I think Zane Grey probably talked to him a lot and learned a lot about Tuba City and what was going on there. So, and accurately portrayed the real history in his book. So if Taddytin was really innocent of what Walter Ruhnke accused him of, why did Ruhnke order this attack? Now, some people have said it was because he wouldn't allow his daughter to go to the boarding school. But the historical record is clear that at the time of the murder, Jeanette was attending the school, so that couldn't be a reason. This is a report by a government inspector who was equally puzzled about why this murder took place. He concluded that Taddytin did not draw a gun on the defendants. He was not apprised of the purpose of their visit. They did not inform him that he was under arrest. According to Ruhnke's instructions to the three men, they were directed to bring Taddytin on a stretcher if necessary. There was no grave necessity for the arrest of the Indian, and not any reason to bring him under the most extreme resort to violence. The immediate cause of his displeasure against the Indian was the latter's former refusal to permit his daughter to attend the school at Tuba. But this object had been accomplished, and the girl had been taken from him and put in school some weeks before. And this inspector said, "It is my firm belief that the three white men understood from their instructions that they were to kill Taddytin at the slightest, if any, provocation." So Walter Ruhnke's actions are even more puzzling in light of the legal precedent, which said you shall not do this, and guidance from his boss back in Washington, D.C. I want to just mention a 1907 similar killing and arrest of Navajo men that occurred and was instigated by one of Walter Ruhnke's colleagues, William Shelton, who was superintendent of the boarding school at Shiprock, New Mexico. And similarly, he was angry at a Navajo man named Baya Lully, who would not let the kids from his community go to Shelton's boarding school. In this case, Shelton was able to convince the army to go in and at night raid the village that these people lived in. And they ended up killing 2 Navajo men and arresting 10 other ones. They took the arrested men to prison at hard labor. There was no due process. And despite various appeals, all the way up to the President of the United States, the government said what they had done was appropriate. Well, eventually, the Arizona Supreme Court got involved, and they said this was strictly illegal, what had happened. an executive officer of the Indian Service has no authority to direct arrests in the absence of law, rule, or regulation authorizing such direction. And the conduct of an Indian is not to be held misbehavior in the absence of a law, rule, or regulation defining it. And they also pointed out that the Navajo tribe had a special provision in their treaty this is from 1866, that Navajo criminals are to be tried and punished according to the laws of the United States. Bad Indians shall not be punished by the United States except by punishment to laws defining their offenses and prescribing the punishments therefore. So what Walter Ruhnke was doing was strictly out of line with this legal precedent. Also, Ruhnke had received a letter the previous year from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs advocating a policy of peace, patience, and genuine friendship and helpfulness instead of violence against people that the agent didn't like. So why did Walter Ruhnke order this attack? It's very puzzling, and we've got reams of documents about the real history of this, but none of them explain that. There's only one document that, in my mind, that does, and that's Zane Grey's book, The Vanishing American. And I have to introduce another missionary who Zane Grey called Morgan. And he was talking to Blucher and about a policy that needed to go into effect, that the Indian girls must go to Morgan's chapel to hear him preach. Taddytin showed intense passion and vehemence. Never shall Gekanyashi go to Morgan. So it wasn't a matter of his daughter not going to the boarding school. It was a matter of his daughter not attending Morgan's church. Furthermore, in The Vanishing American, this scene in which Morgan is talking to Blucher, and he said, if you don't make examples of Taddytin and Nofai, your authority on this reservation will absolutely cease. So Morgan was a very powerful man, in addition to being a missionary. He was quite a politician that knew how to hurt the agents if they didn't follow his will. Taddytin has bucked me. He has opposed me. He will make me look weak to all the Indians. But how to make him an example of him? Morgan leaned forward to whisper tensely, send Ruhr, the policeman, Glendon, and Naylor at night to arrest Taddytin. According to Zane Grey, in this book, his fictional characters instigated the attack due to instructions from the missionary to the agent, or actually an order from him. And then there's this interesting phrase that Zane Grey used when Morgan was threatening Blucher, and said, if you didn't get it, you'll get the steamroller. I put that steamroller under 11 former agents of this reservation, and I'm good for a full dozen. So he had driven out 11 former agents of the reservation using politics, and he was threatening Blucher with doing the same thing with him if he didn't go after Taddytin. This is a letter from a man that the Bureau of Indian Affairs put into service. He's actually the ex-governor of New Mexico, to work out various problems. And he wrote a letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. He said matters at Tuber City are in a very deplorable and depressing condition, owing mainly to the continued presence there of the missionary John Butler. So very clearly, John Butler was Zane Grey's model for Reverend Morgan. He said, "I'm convinced firmly that no man with any self-respect can long hold the office of superintendent in that jurisdiction, or possible and really constructive or effective work there as superintendent if Mr. Butler is retained there." So there was a real missionary that was really threatening to the agents there. In fact, it has been proven to my satisfaction that he glories in and boasts of the number of agents he has put under the steamroller and gotten rid of. So this name for this real missionary, steamroller, was one that Zane Grey used for his fictional missionary. Another testimony was made by this educated Navajo man, George Bancroft, and we've studied him quite a bit. Henry Nardi believes he was quite an inspiration for the protagonist in the book Nofai, and I think Henry's right. Certain things of George's life match what Zane Grey wrote about in the book. But anyway, the real man, George Bancroft, wrote a real letter to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs saying, "I wish to call your attention to the fact that the Navajos are opposed to having John Butler on the reservation. In his preaching, he is always ready to criticize how we dress, how we eat, and about our property. He never presents any good thing to us, but always ridiculing us and scolding and telling us how bad the Navajos are." So this real man, John Butler, from all indication, was the one that told Walter Ruhnke to go out and arrest Taddytin and probably to kill him. I want to look at the bigger picture a little bit and why things like this were allowed to go on in the federal government. This is an article written by William Henry Holmes, who is working for the government as director of the Bureau of American Ethnology, and he wrote this article in 1910 about some problems of the American race. American race is what he called Native Americans. And this horrific statement he made: "The complete absorption or blotting out of the red race will be quickly accomplished, and beyond this, though still far away, we foresee a final reduction of all people to a common race type. If peaceful amalgamation fails, extinction of the weaker by less gentle means will do the work." So someone who didn't go along with the boarding school concept, which was really an attempt to assimilate these kids into modern European ways of thinking. If people didn't go along with that, then they needed to be made extinct by less gentle means. So in a way, Walter Ruhnke was following this script when he initiated this tragedy. The final battle for the races for possession of the world is already on, Holmes wrote. An opposing view, which people didn't think about and they still don't enough, is that the Navajos had their own very profound educational program for their kids, their curriculum, and taught them life lessons on their own outside of any standardized school that the schools would never have even thought about, but were essential. This man, Wolfkiller, was a dear friend of my great-grandmother, Louisa Wetherill, and she was struck by what a sterling character of integrity he was, and asked him, "How did you become this way?" And he said it was because of the training he had received, or the education, from his grandfather and mother when he was a little boy. So being intrigued by that and wanting to pass on his lessons to the younger generations, he told the story to my great-grandmother, and she translated it and wrote it down, and it resulted in this book. He starts out, when I was a young boy, about 6 years old, my grandfather and mother started me on the path of light. And so that was the educational curriculum that he learned. And the book tells what that entailed. It, to me, the main lesson, or one of the main lessons that's very important, is his grandfather particularly taught him to stay connected with nature. Don't be afraid to go out even when things are a little harsh, because a lot of times it's not life-threatening. You're not going to get hurt, but get comfortable with nature and all its manifestations. Of course, be savvy about how to avoid real dangers. But once you're comfortable, start observing the birds, the animals, the plants, the geology, the weather, the stars and moon and sun and clouds. And you'll learn a lot of things about life and develop deep wisdom on how to deal with life's challenges. So to pull kids out of this type of training and put them in a boarding school, sure, you're teaching them reading, writing, arithmetic, but they were teaching them more about modern way of thinking, which may or may not have been a good thing. In fact, I think it's turning out quite bad to teach kids to avoid nature, to be enamored by gadgets and things like phones, these kids. And I'm wondering the wisdom of so-called progress and what it's going to lead to in the next generation. Sometimes I kind of come up with crazy ideas, and I thought maybe the time has come for modern day Native Americans who have these insights to go into the cities and gather up city kids who are alienated from nature and have their own boarding schools out in the wild country. This is kind of fantasy of mine, and so I'll move on, but it's something to think about. Of course, that would be totally unacceptable to kidnap these kids, but that's exactly what the government did back in the boarding school days. I just want to talk a little bit about the research project that led to all this. Henry Nardi of the Zane Grey West Society has been fascinated by the Vanishing American for many years and recognized its special character. And he and I started corresponding on this in 2013. Because of my background with my ancestors and that part of the country, I was able to help him with identifying a lot of the people in the novel and who they were modeled after. And so we could corresponded on that, not just the novel, but the movie. Both of them came out in 1925. So the thumbnails on the right-hand page are just a little sampling of documents that we've gathered down through the years. A lot of these are file folders full of many documents, photographs, and this is just a small sampling. We probably have thousands of pages of documents. Unfortunately, most of it is after the killing of Taddytin, the trial and investigations and so on. And we wanted to know a lot more about Taddytin before he was killed, because that would establish his character. So we tried digging into that. We went to 3 different installations of the National Archives, Washington, D.C., Riverside, and St. Louis. Actually, St. Louis, we didn't go there, but we've had some very productive emails with the staff there. In fact, we've developed relationships with staff at all 3 locations, and they've been amazingly supportive of us, and we really appreciate that. The upper photo on the right is the reading room. So if you go to Washington, D.C. and look for documents, they have probably millions of these boxes full of documents, and you have to have a way to zero in on them. And so there are some techniques, but then eventually you go to this reading room and they'll bring out a cart with boxes that you've ordered. And then you go through those trying to find particular documents that are relevant to your research needs. So it's quite a tedious task. I had been there many times in the past, but the recent visits were done by Henry, both there and at Riverside, California. The bottom photo on the right is a whole different archive that's part of the Smithsonian Institution. And we also found some important documents there. Based on a lot of this work, Ed Meyer of the Society was the ringleader in putting together what's called a web story on the Vanishing American. And if you want to, you should look at it if you haven't already. If you just put in to Google Zane Grey's West Society Vanishing American and search on that, these top hits will take you to the web story. This one in particular takes you to the homepage, which looks like this. And so go into this on your own, but two particular links are relevant to this talk. World's best setting for a novel, in which Ed has documented the places in the book and how they correlate with real places on the landscape. And then characters and their inspirations, and similar to what I've been talking about, but some of the other characters in the book as well, and the real life people that they're modeled after. Then about 2 years ago, I ran across this article in High Country News, and I was struck by the fact that it was talking about Hosteen Taddytin. So the murder of Taddytin was in this contemporary article, and I thought it was a kind of a faded subject in history that nobody was thinking about. So Henry got in touch with the author and the family that had instigated this article, and it turns out the ringleaders were Rita Sinageni and her son Logan, who are descendants of Taddytin. And they felt that an injustice had occurred in the murder of their ancestor, and they wanted to bring it out and have research that told the true story. So they have a business that's headquartered in Page, Arizona, that does tours of part of Antelope Canyon called Canyon X. And if you're ever up there, you might want to link up with them. But we were able to enter into very productive dialogue with the family, and we were able to help them out with a lot of things, and they were able to help us out also. So it's been quite a gratifying relationship. Logan came to our convention this year in Lone Pine, California, and he was a very a good contributor to this talk. He actually came up and supplemented it and answered questions. So we're very grateful to have him there, and we will continue our relationship with him, I'm sure, and his mother. When we first started talking to Logan, he indicated that the story wasn't complete without a photo of Taddytin. And at first, we didn't know of any photos of Taddytin. He lived in a very remote area of the reservation, and there were not too many people passing through there in the early days. So the chance of somebody taking a photo of him, it seemed pretty slim. But one remarkable thing about this region is there's this cliff dwelling inscription house right in the heart of the northern part of it that did receive some attention in the early days. It's actually part of Navajo National Monument. And in 1914, a large archaeological expedition came there, sponsored by the University of Utah and led by a man named Byron Cummings. And he brought some of his college students along. One of them, named Reed Aldred, took many photographs. So we went through his photos and we found this remarkable photo he had taken of a Navajo group. And it was quite clear to us from the descriptions that the man with the hat was Taddytin. One of the photographer buddies is sitting next to him, but this is Taddytin and his family. So this fine photo we have to help illustrate this history. Shortly after we contacted Logan and his family, they issued this documentary about Taddytin, and it also involves Navajo culture and the beliefs of his ancestors and the history. And I think it's mainly to show visitors to Canyon X and give them some depth of the history of the place. But it's also been shown in viewings of movies, and it might even take off even more. The director of it, Joe Raffa, is an award-winning producer, and it's a very fine documentary. But the family decided, based on additional information and to try and convey what type of a person Taddytin really was, they would like to do another documentary. And we were complimented, Henry and I, when they invited us to be part of that. We met down in Tucson at the Arizona State Museum and did some additional research, and they did some filming there. And then we went up to Scottsdale, and they had a whole day devoted to filming me and interviewing me, and another day for Henry. So that documentary is still in process, and it may be a while before it's out, but I think it's going to be a very fine story. So closing the book on this talk, I'd like to just throw out one other question. We've seen the remarkable amount of real history in The Vanishing American. Are there, you folks who know Zane Grey's books, are there any other of his romances that might similarly contain valuable historical insights that maybe the history books failed to capture? And in closing, I'd just like to honor all the people that have been involved with this and down through the past few years and the help they've given. And I think it's going to be exciting to see what happens in the future. I want to call attention particularly to these folks with the National Archives who've been so kind to us in our research. Thank you.